Yeah, I think like when you look around the world today, the idea that the capitalist system isn't working, the notion of capitalism as a destructive system, are both ideas that I think are quite easy to identify with, like increasingly so, because the system's clearly in a state of deep crisis. It's clearly a system that, where there's a drive towards war, look at the impact of climate change, mass poverty, and alienation as well. And I think it can be quite easy when you look around at the world today to forget that actually at capitalism's birth, it was an incredibly dynamic system. And in Marx's time, capitalism was still in its revolutionary period. And the previous member of our organisation, Duncan Hallis, once said that, described when Marx was writing about capitalism was just a pinprick in the Pennines. So it was, the working class was still incredibly small at this point. But even at this very early stage, Marx was able to sort of draw out the driving force at the core of the system, which was accumulation. And this, he described how this spurred on production in a way that meant that capitalism completely transformed the world that we live in. And you can think of some of the examples of the advances that sort of humanity's made in capitalism's lifetime in terms of, electricity, telephones, cars, aeroplanes, high-speed trains, the internet, medical advances and things that we've made. And then you sort of contrast that to, looking back at feudal society, where actually, regular crises of underproduction were sort of, intrinsic feature. Where there wasn't enough produced the basics needed for human survival, and when capitalism came about at capitalism's early stages, it made mass production possible, and of course it didn't change the fact that most people's lives were dictated by drudgery and by exploitation, and actually in quite a few ways I think it probably intensified this if you look at the process of the Industrial Revolution and things. But undoubtedly the rise of capitalism was a period of growth on a sort of scale that was completely undreamt of at previous human history in a way that feudalism couldn't deliver. And when Marx was writing about accumulation, he was on the one hand pointing to this force that he could see in action driving forwards, the sort of the huge expansion across the globe that he was beginning to see. But his writings were also, I think, really prophetic in that not only was he able to sort of identify this drive forwards and what he could see around him, but he was able to sort of draw out the contradiction at the heart of the system and show, which is quite helpful for us, I think, when we look at the system today and see the level of crisis that we face. And this was not something that he was experiencing on this scale in his time, but he can still explain it. He uncovered really that the very thing that makes capitalism so dynamic, the very feature of capitalism that propels the whole system forwards, is also what throws it backwards at the same time and makes it prone to crisis. And this is what Marx described as the accumulation of capital. How in the pursuit of greater and greater profits, capitalists are forced to accumulate the wealth, and how in doing so this actually does lead to a long run tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and therefore actually undermines the very thing that they're actually chasing. So what I wanted to do with the meeting really was I wanted to start by looking a bit at accumulation, what it is, how it works, and why. I then wanted to go on and look a bit at the paradox of accumulation, I think, and explore a bit what we mean when we say that it causes the rate of profit to fall. And then look a bit at how the system deals with this and what Marx described as countervailing tendencies or counteracting influences in the system that try and redress the balance of its fallen rate and profit. And then come on to where I think the next meeting will probably pick up, which is how crises really are intrinsic to the system and how the drive for accumulation is at the root of that. So I think accumulation is the driving force of capitalism, and it is also the fundamental difference between this system and the previous feudal society. So if you look at feudalism, you had serfs who would work under a feudal lord. They produced really for the lord's personal consumption. It was about keeping the rich in a life of luxury. Whereas under capitalism, workers you don't just produce for your boss's own personal consumption, although obviously they do live off our backs. But actually, you produce more to produce profit more generally. So while feudal serfs would maybe work, 2 days a week on their own plot, where they produced the sort of the absolute basics to sustain them and their family to be able to continue to work there, the majority of their week went on working on the lord's plot. So most of their labouring time went towards maintaining the ruling classes, and that sort of idea of like the walls of the lord's stomach kind of dictated the sort of the limits of the system in a sense. But capitalism doesn't work like this. instead it's about producing for a profit. And so under capitalism, it's the market that forms the landscape for competition between different capitalists. So rather than there being any collective way to sort of, sit and work out what it is that society is producing based on need, it much more depends on what products can be sold and at what price. So the whole production process really depends not on the need for things, but on the ability to sell and buy them on the market. And to sell goods, the capitalists have to produce them as cheaply as possible because they're competing with other capitalists, and that's why Marx describes them as a band of warring brothers, because what the previous meeting would have outlined is really the key divide in capitalism is between the working class who are exploited and the ruling class, but actually within the ruling class, they are also competing with each other because they're battling to dominate the market for whatever goods it is that they produce. And they don't produce in this way for our benefit. I remember when I was at university, you'd always come up against people on the stalls who would say, the sort of free market kind of ideologues that said, well, competition's great, it gives us so much choice, this drive for competition means that we've got so many different options of the things that we can buy and produce, and actually it's a much better way to produce things to have competition at the heart of it. But I don't know, I think, something you go down the supermarket and you spend so long looking at all these many different versions of one product, and this is supposed to be the ultimate choice that we can have, when actually the vast majority of us can only afford to get the basics range anyway. So it's I think this is this is not true, that that competition creates a system where we've got this wonderful choice, and it's not about that at all. It's about the drive for profit. But what I think the example does show, when you think about all the different brands that exist, is how much competition dictates the parameters within the system, and that it's not really a choice for the capitalists. They're bound by the need to undercut others, and therefore they're bound to produce in this way. And to do this, they have to not just accumulate. They don't just produce to make profits to be rich. They produce to make profits so that they can accumulate it and reinvest that back in order to stay in business, in order to continue to be able to compete with other businesses and things. So I think the logic of the capitalist system really forces the demand on the capitalist to reinvest this surplus value, which, as was explored in the previous meeting, is what the bosses make out of the exploitation of workers, and this has to be reinvested back into the production process. So while capitalism has led to huge advances in production that have undoubtedly benefited humanity in a number of different ways, the driving force isn't human need. The driving force is this drive to accumulate. So Marx described this saying, really it's the exchange value rather than the use value of the goods that ultimately matters for capital. You think about the recent example in the food industry, the whole horse meat scandal, and it's quite clear really that it shows quite sharply that there's no care for the actual use value of what's being produced. There's it's not driven by human need. This is irrelevant as long as it continues to produce a profit. Really no capitalist, if they're going to survive in this system, can afford to stand still. So it does mean that the system's incredibly dynamic, but really in this sort of endless chase for profit, the production kind of takes on a bit of a life of its own, and it's it's not planned really. It becomes an end in itself. The capitalists end up investing capital for the production for commodities, not to use them, not to get rich, but really just to churn out more and more in order to try and make profit. And this process of accumulation can manifest itself in two ways. Firstly, the capitalist can simply expand their production by reinvesting the surplus value in the sort of the more of what they've got already to produce, so they can employ more workers, and they can get more of the sort of machinery and things that they use. Maybe they'll set up another factory. This is one way that they can accumulate and reinvest. So essentially it's about buying more of the same kinds of what Marx called constant capital, so the machinery and things that are used to produce, and variable, which is the workers whose exploitation provide the profits. Or the capitalist can invest in new technology. And as a result, I think, of this need to produce as cheaply as possible throughout the system, there's been a constant, throughout the system's history, there's been a constant drive towards revolutionising the production process, investing in sort of fancier or more advanced machines so that, you can increase the productivity of each worker. And, if you think about the one obvious example of this is when you go down the supermarket. I seem to be spending a lot of times in supermarkets. But if you go down the supermarket, you've got the self-service machines, which obviously are used because you don't need to employ as many workers. And, you have maybe one worker that's responsible for operating all those machines, and you're therefore getting more out of that worker in terms of their productivity. So Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionising the instruments of production, and thereby this in turn revolutionises the relations of production themselves, and with them the whole relations of society. So why is this necessary for them to do this? Well, the main way that capitalists are competing is by cutting prices all the time, and Marx called this the cheapening of commodities. So he wrote, the cheapness of commodities depends on the productivity of labour. So, come back to that idea that when each worker sets in motion some kind of new, much more efficient machinery, they're able to produce much more in a set period of time than they would have previously. So the first capitalist to get new technology and use it in this way manages to, boost their profits in the short term by getting ahead of the other capitalists in the industry and undercutting them, because they're able to charge more than the value of what they're producing, but at less than, quite a lot less than what the other capitalists are charging for it. But as you can probably predict, this competition then forces capitalists around them to get in on this new deal, and so quite soon the advantage will be wiped out, because as the value drops, they'll be forced to find some other kind of way of cutting prices and of making labour more productive. So this kind of leads us on, I think, to the paradox of accumulation, I think, which is the tendency of the rate of profit, not the actual profits, but the rate of profit to fall. Because I think understanding accumulation as a compulsive drive on capitalists who exist in an environment of competition helps us understand the kind of mad dash expansion of industry, in capitalism's early years. But along the way, a byproduct of this same process has been the inherent periodic crises in the system. Because as capitalism has got older, the balance of where investment goes is tipped towards dead labour rather than living labour. So people might know it's been explained in the previous meeting. Dead labour is the machinery, the land, and so on that we use. Living labour is the workers themselves, and partly what we just went through in terms of the need to revolutionise the means of production has meant that this investment is tipped more and more towards dead labour. So what it means is that there's been, throughout the system's history, a mass growth in the means of production on the one hand, with a quite limited growth in the number of workers employed, and also because unemployment provides a reserve army of workers, a limited growth in the real wages on the other hand. So this process isn't just shit for working class people who have to endure obviously unemployment and low wages all the time, but it also leads to a fundamental problem for the capitalists themselves, because the process of accumulation acts to change the nature of the production process as well. So as the productivity of labour rises, as we're using more and more machines to get more out of workers, the profit made on the capitalist's original investments tends to fall. Why is this? This is because, as was went through in the previous meeting as well, that dead labour itself can't actually generate extra surplus value. Surplus value is generated off the exploitation of workers. So the more that imbalance develops throughout the system, the more that the rate of profit is going to fall. And Marx also, a quote I quite like from Marx, is he says, modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, it's like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he's called up by his spells. And there is also this periodic tendency in capitalism to produce more goods than can be sold, as accumulation drives production of more and more commodities, and as people are either unemployed or low wages, can't afford to buy them, and is described as a crisis of overproduction. It's not really a crisis of overproduction, because while this is all going on, people are starving, people live in poverty, people can't get housing. We're not overproducing. It's just that we're producing too much to be sold because people can't afford to buy the goods. And while it's true that the pressures of competition force capitalists to accumulate to reinvest, which is at the heart of the system really, Marx also noted that the capitalists will only invest if they think there's a guaranteed reasonable profit to come back. So when the profit rate is very low, instead of reinvesting the accumulated profits, often capitalists will sit on them instead to wait out the crisis, which in turn exacerbates the situation as factories are shutting down, workers are laid off and unemployment rises. So this is all quite the sort of the paradox, I suppose, of accumulation, which is intrinsic in the system, and how does the system deal with this, deal with these crises that come off the back of this, and this will be dealt with again in the next meeting in the series. But crucially, the cure for the system's tendency for the rate of profit to fall is crisis itself. It's where it's temporarily resolved by the mass destruction of capital, the concentration and centralisation of capital. So what we mean by this is that throughout a crisis, there'll be a minority of capitalists who survive it. There'll be a minority of capitalists who actually do very well out of it, while they sort of swallow up all the failed capitals that haven't managed to survive the crisis. But what it means is that the machinery, the land, the buildings, and so on can then be bought up very cheaply. And this again will be dealt with in a bit more detail in the next session. But Marx also explored what he described as countervailing tendencies or counteracting influences, which is looking at influences within the system that tend to restore the profit rates or even increase them for a time being. And they can do this. This can take place in a number of ways. Capitalists can try to increase the rate of exploitation of their workers. So, for example, this could be through a drive to increase the number of working hours that people work in a week, or they can try also to increase the relative surplus value by slashing wages. And this is obviously we can see how this plays a quite important role for the capitalists. But it does clearly have limits because there are only so many hours in the day. And if workers are, too malnourished to work, they're unable to house themselves and so on, then actually it doesn't really benefit the capitalist in the long run because they need a healthy, productive, efficient workforce. Another more systematic countervailing tendency stems from the actual process of accumulation itself, which is the cheapening of the constant capital used in production. Because the increases of productivity that come about through accumulation tend to have two effects. One is, as we said, the fall in the rate of profit, and the other is the fall in the price of commodities as capitalists are battling to undercut each other. So some of these commodities are, for example, the machinery and the things that they actually use. These are also a means of production. So the process of accumulation can cheapen the means of production that the capitalists need to buy to keep the system, to keep their business going. And on the one hand, this obviously helps to increase their profit rates in the short term, but there are two problems which also mean that the profit rates still tend to fall. Because if the capitalist has bought their piece of machinery, their means of production in the past, then the fact that the prices are going to lower isn't necessarily going to help those particular capitalists, because what it means is that those competitors who are slower to invest enjoy the benefits of the cheaper machinery. And they'll be able to produce their commodities at an even cheaper rate. But you also have to think of capitalism as a kind of a holistic system in that sense, where there's the constant exploitation of workers, the constant sort of pumping out of surplus value and it's got to be reinvested somewhere. And if less of it is going to be spent on machinery, then there's still surplus value left that has to go somewhere. And you can, some capitalists can attempt to invest it in other means of production, but this will mean more accumulation and will again contribute to the falling rate of profit. So the only exception to this really is if there's some kind of leak out of the capitalist circuit of production, where the surplus value can be drawn out of this circuit. It can be in some way destroyed or wasted or by hoarding the value so that it's not reinvested in another round of accumulation. And you look at the post-war boom as an example of this kind of countervailing tendency, where by investing in the arms economy, capitalism was able to slow down the falling rate of profit, but it wasn't able to stop it. It was about slowing it down. And also this can last for a limited period of time, because there can be a whole number of political demands on the system, then political interests of the system that come to clash up against the economic interests to continue countervailing tendencies. So, just to summarise, that countervailing tendencies can act against the falling rate of profit within the system. They can slow it down, but the overall tendency is still there in the long run as a constant feature in the system. And as I said, really the crucial thing for Marx about how the profit rates can be restored is actually about the destruction brought about through economic crisis, where whole chunks of the economy are destroyed. And I think when you look at the present economic crisis, it's the worst crisis that the system has seen. People can, it's right, I think, to point and say, well, the bankers caused this crisis, because it helps to make the point that actually working class people who are being made to pay for this crisis, that they've had nothing to do, that they don't have an interest in the system that generates these crises. It's right to point that they shouldn't be paying for it, and it should be those who benefit from it that pay for it. But the banking crisis itself was not the cause. It's been a symptom of something that's much more intrinsic in the capitalist system. And I think also there's a sense in a crisis that there's no money. There's just no money, and that's the problem, and that's why we've got to accept cuts to our services, and that's why we just can't invest in the health service and all these kind of things. But actually, when you look at accumulation, it is the case that in a crisis there are capitalists who will sit on their accumulated wealth because the profit rate is so low that they don't believe they can get returns on their investments. If you look at the 2008 crisis, people said, well, yes, it's all terrible, but look, China's booming, it's okay, but actually the rate of profit is falling in China too, because this is a global economic system, it's a global economic crisis, and the fact that those economies that China trades with are being impacted in this way means that, basically, if someone's not going to buy your ship that you're trying to sell to them, then it's going to impact you economically as well, is a simple way of putting it, I suppose. So crises are the system's way of restoring the profit rate, and this will be looked at much more in the next session. Trotsky explained that capitalism lives by crises and booms in the same way that humans live by inhaling and exhaling. So first there's a boom in industry, then a stoppage, next a crisis, followed by a stoppage in the crisis, and then an improvement, another boom, and so on. This is how the system works. So crises are not new in capitalism, but they have been an intrinsic part of how the system works since its birth, and accumulation is right at the root of that. Crises don't simply recur on a sort of, on the same basis each time they come back on the same level. They tend to get worse as the system gets older, because as the system has got older, capitalism's become sort of sclerotic, like an old person whose body's beginning to seize up and whose breathing becomes increasingly erratic. And, with the deepening crisis that comes, the more and more difficult it becomes to overcome it. And therefore the need to savage working class people's lives is ever increasing. The need to intensify the exploitation in this quest to chase the falling rate of profit, which is endemic in the system. And I think just to sort of end, I suppose, there can be an assumption that because capitalism is crisis-ridden, that its demise and the oncoming socialist revolution is something that's inevitable. That we've had feudalism, it came to an inevitable end. Then there was capitalism. Next, there's going to be socialism, and that's going to come at some point. And this is not the case. Marx made this clear. But if we don't get rid of this system, if we don't end this continuing cycle of crises and continue on the current path, then you can see what Marx described as the ruin of contending classes, where, who knows, he wouldn't have been able to have predicted what shape this might take in terms of, nuclear disaster, ecological disaster, nuclear war. You can picture some kind of post-capitalist sort of nightmare where society can go backwards. And if you think about the Dark Ages as sort of feudalism's version of this, it's not all inevitable that we're going to go onwards and upwards. So really we face a choice, I think, between continuing in worsening crises of capitalism or the transformation to a new society through a socialist revolution. And capitalism's incredible dynamism that we talked about at the beginning of the meeting has organised and expanded the forces of production on a global scale, and through doing this it's handed potential collective power to those who have a common interest and who have a capacity within the system to overthrow it in a way that previously wasn't the case in history, in the way that previous exploited classes weren't able to do. So luckily for us, capitalism has created, as Marx described, its own gravedigger in the working class, and it's possible and utterly necessary, therefore, to put these fantastic forces of production to much better use and to the benefit of all humanity.